Welcome to Reignite's webinar. We started this series called Emerging, and for obvious reasons, we have been working for quite some time writing this book called Emerging. And I am happy to say that it's almost out. We did start writing it in 2020, thinking we knew what it was going to be like to emerge from the pandemic. Well, we put that back on the shelf and waited another couple of years. But we are excited to say that our book Emerging, subtitled Boomers Speak Out About Life in and Through and Beyond the Pandemic. So many of you have helped us write that. Your stories have inspired us, but we kind of began wondering if it had lost its shelf life, are we through this thing? But 2 days ago, we had an amazing meeting with a group of national leaders, denominational leaders on this topic, and realized, this is something that has not only impacted every individual on this globe, but it continues to impact how we live and how we operate in the world. So Emerging is about coming out of the pandemic. It's really highlights the stories of boomers as we've experienced it in different ways. So we'll let you know when it's out, but we think it'll be by December 1st. But because we were writing that book and hearing stories, we said, there are some topics that are really the hot topics that we need to cover. And that's when we started doing some of these webinars that some of you have joined us. So today we are actually going to talk about a wonderful subject of actually flourishing after the impact of the COVID pandemic. So I just want to welcome you. Richard and I are here in Seattle, Washington, and are happy to have you join us. And Richard, you can introduce our guest.
Thank you, Leona. It's our privilege today to have with us Dr. Mark Roberts, who is a senior strategist for Fuller's Max Dupree Center for Leadership, where he focuses on the spiritual development and thriving of leaders. He's the principal writer of the daily devotional Life for Leaders and the founder of the Dupree Center's Flourishing in the Third of Life initiative. Now, if you go to the website at dupree.org, you can read his short bio or the full bio. And the full bio there's just too much there to go through today. But it's quite extensive. He was previously the executive director of the Dupree Center and the lead pastor of a church in Southern California and the senior director of Laity Lodge in Texas. He's a prolific author, and it's our privilege to have him with us today. We actually did a webinar with Mark back a year ago on finding purpose in the pandemic, and you can find that on their website. So it's a mutual kind of relationship. Welcome, Dr. Roberts, Mark, and it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Well, Richard, it's great to be with you again, and yes, to do a second webinar. You were our first webinar. We were just barely out of the blocks when we got connected with you and your work, and so I'd reached out and said, "Boy, could we do something with you?" And that was in October 2 years ago. It's kind of feels like ages, but you really helped us get started and really helped us begin to serve people in the third of life. So it's great to be back with you, and I'm excited about your book. December 1st is coming quickly, so we're looking forward to it.
It's coming, yes, and all about emerging from the pandemic.
Yeah.
But tell us about your role at Fuller, the Dupree Center for Leadership, and then what is that third initiative all about?
Yeah. So I've been at Fuller Seminary now for 7.5 years. I began as the executive director of the Max Dupree Center for Leadership, which, though we're a part of the seminary, we really focus out. Our main purpose is to serve Christian leaders in the wider marketplace, in education and business and government, and so we're not so much focused on our students as out. And I led that initiative or that center for 6 years, and along the way started feeling a strong draw to this third work. the same time, I had hired a brilliant senior director who worked under me, Michaela O'Donnell, who it just became kind of clear to me about, now 2 years ago, that it was time for her to start leading the Dupree Center. And I really wanted to be able to focus on our third initiative. So a year and a half ago, she basically stepped into my position. I stepped down as now a senior strategist working for her. And that was largely so she could lead, and she's doing a fantastic job. And so I could really focus on our third work, which is work to serve people in the third of life. As you all know, that's a fairly nebulous kind of identification. It's somewhat meant to be. But we're really talking about folks who are 55 and older. Strictly speaking, in the U.S. today, 52.7 is the average third. But we're really talking about the sort of the latter third of life, which you folks have talked about as third stage and third calling. And so we're really talking about that same thing, wanting to serve folks in this season of life.
Yes, that's why it resonated so much with us. I know it was Max Dupree's book, Third, or the third book he wrote that kind of inspired that a bit.
Yeah. It's interesting. So quite a few years ago, the Dupree Center started working on these issues, and then their leader at the time retired, and it sort of went dormant for a while. But I picked it up, and partly I picked it up because in my work with the Dupree Center, for the most part, for the first 6 years, I was focusing on business leaders and other leaders in the marketplace. And I would ask them, how can we serve you? And I'd hear various things. But increasingly, I would hear from leaders who were, around 60 years old, something like, I know I'm going to have to retire at some point. I'm mentoring some younger leaders, and they're going to need to step up. I don't even know how to think about retirement, and my church is not no help at all. You guys should do something about this. And first time I heard it, it's like, that's interesting. Then I started hearing it regularly, and I would say in response, that's very interesting. I think that's important. If we ever got some seed money to do it, we could do something, because that's kind of how we fund ourselves, with grants and donations. And along the way, about 4 years ago now, a couple said, well, I think we would want to help out with that. And so that enabled us to start doing this third work, which largely meant it enabled me to switch my job and start focusing where we are. But I got into this because the people that we seek to serve were saying, we need help with this, and you folks should do it. And that's actually how it all started.
So much of the conversation around retirement centers on finances and financial planning, and yet people don't always have a life plan for this season of life. And so that's what excites us about the third Dupree Center's third, our third calling, just to try to educate people, that inspire people that there's another way to think about this stage of life other than just disengagement, withdrawal, and leisure. And frankly, that's the dominant paradigm in our culture, of retirement as leisure. So how do you help people find and live out a continuing purpose in this life, stage of life? So
I was speaking at a church last month, and about these things, and a woman said to me, I retired 6 months ago, and I'm miserable. I think that's about the worst decision I ever made. And for her, it was about losing a lot of relationships, but also losing a sense of purpose in life. And the whole idea, and you folks have been central to this in our work and beyond, and helping folks to realize, wait a minute, God still has a purpose for you, and there's a lot of potential. And she was really excited to learn that, wait a minute, I guess my life and my meaningful existence isn't over yet. But she's a bright Christian woman. So this is not somebody who is, living in some cave, but she just hadn't heard this stuff before.
Well, when you leave your profession or your job, whether you're a grocery clerk checking people out or you're a high-level professional, that loss of a job and a place and a team and a role, all of that leaves you pretty empty unless you figure out ways to fill that in. And the dominant message of the culture is that you fill it in with leisure.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with leisure in and of itself, but it's not the end all. It's not the purpose for which we live.
Amen.
Well, tell us what you've learned during this time, expanding on what you've already said. Are there any surprises, any takeaways? And then we'll talk about flourishing here in a second.
Yeah. Well, so I have been significantly engaged in this work for 3 years. The last year and a half, it's been the main part of my work at the Dupree Center. And, in this time I've done, lots and lots of reading and learning and reading of more popular books, and then academic work and theological work, and really trying to learn and figure it out. And, part of what surprised me is just the vast amount of information out there, especially academic information about aging and how much this has been studied, but it's relatively unknown. And frankly, it's somewhat inaccessible for most folk to get there, because you need a connection to theological institution to see most of it, or educational institutions. So anyway, I was surprised at how much there was, and I've learned so much. So one thing would be, let me mention 2 or 3. One would be just the extraordinary potential that older adults have to flourish, both in terms of their own well-being, but also making a difference in life. And I think I sort of knew that, because growing up, one set of my grandparents, my mother's parents, I was very close to, and they actually lived full and rich and giving and difference-making lives into their 80s. So I kind of knew that. But I think I was surprised at just how many stories there are and how many testimonies of people living richly and fully. So that was a little bit of a surprise. Another thing, and I'm sure I'll talk more about this in our conversation, I was surprised at how utterly important relationships are to flourishing in the third of life. I would have had them on my list of things, but I don't think I would have had them as high as relationships belong. One of the most recent surprises, and I expect Richard and Leona, you folks have seen this. There is a book out last year or earlier this year by Becca Levy, who is a professor of social psychology at Yale, who is really an expert in older adulthood. And she wrote a book called Breaking the Age Code. And it was largely based on research she did earlier in her career. Basically, she took a town of people and sort of studied everything about them there was to study. And part of what she was trying to find out is what makes a difference for people as they get older who die earlier and die later. In other words, longevity. What contributes to longevity? And she worked out all the different factors. And what she came up with, which is just stunning, is that as people get older, those who have a negative view of aging itself, like you get old, you'll be frail, you'll be infirm, there's no meat, blah, blah. Those who have a negative view of aging, let's just say they die at 75 years. Those who have a positive view of aging live on average 7.5 years longer. And just that factor, in other words, she factored out everything else. So that what does it say to us? It says that how we think about aging and how we think about what's coming as we get older is gigantically important for our lifespan, but also for our health span, for our well-being. And I think had you asked me, does having a positive view of aging matter? I would say, yeah, probably adds a year of life. 7.5 years of life was the difference in this study. And it's been now replicated many times throughout the world. I mean, to me, that's just stunning. And it also says that the kinds of things that we're doing, Richard and Leona and others of our partners, man, this is really important, really important.
That's awesome. Yeah. And it's amazing how many old people, really old people, have a negative view of aging.
Right.
I think even my parents living in a retirement community and then eventually in assisted living really never saw themselves as old, but they were around people who were very old and they had kind of an ageist attitude. Of course, my mom sold real estate until she was 85. And so, that was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, being old people are always the ones who are older than we are. I get, but I remember the first time. So when I was down at Lady Lodge in Texas leading a retreat, and we had an older woman who was, I think, 85, do devotions in the morning. And this was the opening line of her devotion after she read the scripture. I love being old. I had never heard anybody. First of all, she's just admitting it, like I am old. And I love it. And her explanation was all about the growth that she's made personally and the meaning of her life and the things she once fretted about that and growing closer to the Lord. And I remember, to me, that was kind of like an eye-opening moment that a person could be old and say, this is the best time of my life. Turns out, now that I know, there's actually a lot of research that shows that on average, older adults are much happier than younger adults and middle-aged adults. That's what the research shows. Laura Carstensen down at Stanford's done a lot on this. I just never knew that. And things like that are very encouraging, but then it's important to let folks know that, wait a minute, there is huge potential for your life here. And we're helping folks discover that.
That's great. Well, as you know, we're very much involved in research and writing about this whole topic of emerging and how people are coming out of the pandemic. We're not totally through that yet, but we're kind of on the other side of the worst part of it. And so we're very fascinated by how people are going to emerge from this pandemic and flourish, not just exist, but actually flourish in their life. So tell us a little bit about your emphasis on flourishing and where that comes from in your whole third initiative.
Sure. So initially, I started thinking about flourishing because my academic background is New Testament. Before that, I did philosophy in college, and there's a lot of conversation in secular sources about what they'll call human flourishing. That's a very popular phrase, and it's about basically how you live well in all parts of life. And so I came into this study with this sense that human flourishing is kind of what we're talking about here. Then I started digging into scripture and found a lot, but I found this passage in the Psalms. Now, I'd read through the Psalms, I don't know, 15 times in my life at least. I come to this passage in Psalm 92 that it's as if I'd never seen it before. And it says, the righteous flourish like the palm tree. This is Psalm 92, 12-15. The righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God. So you got the righteous flourish. And again, they flourish. In old age, they still produce fruit. They're always green and full of sap. Now, I love many things about that. I love the full of sap. The idea is that they're green and they have a lot of sap in them to produce leaves and fruit and all that. But this notion of the righteous flourishing, even in old age, they still produce fruit. What really makes me happy is that the Hebrew of that reads literally, with gray hair, they still produce fruit. So I'm claiming that as sort of my life verse. Anyway, the promise there is so clear that not only if we are right in Christ and living as God would have us do in Christ, we will flourish, including when we are old, and we will continue to be fruitful. So it's not just about, well, I'm living well for myself. It's about I'm living in a way that makes a difference in the world. And that promise just sort of jumped out at me. And that's really kind of our core conviction in our work at the Dupree Center in the Flourishing of the Third of Life, that Scripture offers us this promise. And then, of course, Jesus talks about, about those who are in him living abundantly or fully, and those who abide in him being fruitful. So we're just basic, and he didn't say, but that when you hit 65, that's no longer true. So God's vision for us is full and fruitful living, is flourishing in all seasons of life. And that's kind of our core conviction. And that's where we got it.
That's a great passage, and it's one that certainly has shaped our view of this third of life, and even our ministry. But what practices or ideas do you think are crucial for those who want to flourish on this side of the pandemic?
Well, one idea would simply be, and I've sort of already said it, that it's possible to do it, that God intends. Now, none of us, and I know your work, you're not denying that as we get older, there are certain losses, there are challenges, there are physical challenges. We'll very likely lose loved ones if we live quite a long way. And so we're not saying, oh, it's going to be easy and great. But what we are saying is that God actually has for us the potential to live fully and to live fruitfully as we get older. And so partly that idea, just that's possible. Because there's a lot in the culture that says, man, when you're old, you're washed up. You know, you're done making a difference. As you said, Richard, earlier, you can play and have fun. But so we need to, so part of the idea is, wait a minute, God has so much more. I mentioned earlier, the thing that so struck me as I was doing the research is how important relationships are for the third of life. There's this major Harvard study. It began actually in the late 30s. It's now called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. And they basically tracked a bunch of Harvard students, and then they added some others in to fill out the pool of people. But they tracked them throughout their life. And they measured just about anything they could think to measure, not even knowing what the purpose was, other than we got to collect all this data. But their question as the thing developed was, what is it that will enable somebody to be living well at 80? What is it that's going to make a difference? And they did all this studying and all this stuff. And one of the directors of this study, a man named George Vaillant, when asked to summarize, what did you learn? He said, the most important thing about living well when we're older is relationships, relationships, relationships. They found, for example, that the best predictor of good health at 80 is not your cholesterol score at 50, but the quality of your relationships at 50. And if you're married, the quality of your marriage. Now, I mean, that fits with what we understand about Scripture, and I think what God shows us. But I wasn't expecting that. I would have thought, what's most important about if you're going to live well, health. Physical health is number one. Actually, part of the thing they found is that people with good relationships tend to have better physical health. And so, anyway, one of the great surprises, but one of the great ideas then is the importance of relationship. Well, then the practices that follow, we need to ask ourselves, am I nurturing good, healthy, deep, growing relationships in this season of life? Certainly, if I'm married, am I investing in the quality of my marriage? But with family and with close friends, am I connected to church? And this is a course where your stuff on emerging becomes important, because for a long time, our relationships were very limited. One bad practice would be to continue really cut off from most people, because we're just, we're kind of in that rut. So the practice is to develop relationship, being in some kind of deeper friendships or covenant groups or mentoring groups, or, all the different ways that we connect. So real practically, one of the things I've done after learning all this is I identified there are a few people in my life with whom I'm really close, but we're busy people and we may not see each other much. And I am now very regularly reaching out to these people. One friend, he moved away. I don't see him very often, but we have a once a month phone call just to catch up on life. I would not have done that, except that I've learned how important relationships are. So that would be one practice. There are others I could say, but I'll stop.
Well, so what you mentioned is referenced is this pandemic has cut off so many relationships. And for 2.5 years, or at least for the first year and a half, People weren't seeing people,
Right.
weren't going anywhere. Depending on where they lived and what their convictions were about the pandemic, obviously some people just kept on doing life regardless. But we also, in our surveys and our interviews, uh, found there's a whole range of people. Some had totally disengaged and have not yet re-engaged
Right.
in relationship or in church or in
Right.
community. Others have done better at getting back into relationship, but definitely the pandemic has disrupted the social fabric and broken a lot of relationships, even in families where they had harmony before. They'd have differences in vaccines and masks and all kinds of things. So how do we how do we get back into relationship and restore that sense of community coming out of or emerging
Yeah.
from this pandemic?
Well, and you're right by what you've identified in terms of one of the real, and I think in many ways, other than the fact that many people died from COVID-19, I think one of the most painful things was that many of those died alone. And so even the families are caring. I mean, I have friends that couldn't be with their father when he died. I mean, that's a huge loss. And so I think part of what we need to do, especially we haven't done it, is acknowledge that and share in it and be there for each other in that. And that can still be a very painful thing. On the positive side, if we recognize that relationships are crucial to our living well, not to mention what it gives to others, then one of the things we can do at this point is look at our relationship. I mean, the pandemic kind of forced us to have perspective, like on church. So for the first time in my life, I really didn't go to church. I watched church, but that's a different thing. And that gave me different perspective on the experience of church. And I know for some people, their conclusion is, man, it's just better to be at home. I could be in my pajamas with a cup of coffee and watch church and it's all good. Problem there, of course, is relationships, and so I think one of the most important things we can do in this season is to say, what are the most important relationships for me? And there may be opportunity to invest in a new way. So I mentioned I was speaking at this church about some of this stuff. And after I was all done and we had people process and everything, and then came back a little later to discover, did it make any difference in people's lives? And just simple things. But one woman said, I'm a retired teacher and I just went to the local elementary school and said, I'm a retired teacher. Can I help? And they said, well, we could just use you on the playground just to like hang out with the kids and play with them and just be a good role model. So now she's investing there in those relationships. Another person said, I realized I need to mentor my niece. So she's now begun a mentoring relationship. So again, as we think about these things and we say, what are the relationships that I need to invest in? Who are the people God has put in my life that really matter? And that may look different now than it did before, right? We may decide, I was doing this thing over here. That's really not life-giving. But the thing that won't help is if we sort of allow the inertia of the pandemic to keep us from being relationally connected to people. The other great thing, actually, I think that happened in the pandemic for some was that they discovered Zoom as a relational thing. So, for example, my wife at the beginning of the pandemic, she has this group of friends who are all her age, all in the third of life, and they would get together about every quarter. When the pandemic started, they thought, well, why don't we just try getting together every Friday evening on Zoom? So they started doing it, and they did it all the way through all the shutdown and everything. They're still doing it. So she has built into her life now this practice of every week connecting with the deepest friends she has in life. That didn't happen before the pandemic. And so again, I think we can ask, what is the technology that's available to us? What does it offer to us? Okay, I'm going to stop. I'm going on and on.
That's fascinating because I was with a group of men for 10 years up in Bellingham, Washington. And when we moved to Seattle, I kind of lost connection with them. But when the pandemic hit, they reconvened over Zoom and they invited me back to the table.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so every Wednesday morning at 7:30, we get together by Zoom. And now the big discussion is, as things are being lifted, do they want to reconvene in person over a cup of coffee at a local restaurant, have breakfast and chat? But they actually find that the Zoom-based platform is quite enjoyable. So what they've concluded is that periodically they'll go out and they'll meet in person, and they'll see each other face to face. But otherwise, for the weekly meeting, they're quite content to continue with the Zoom connection.
See, now, isn't that interesting? And I think that's one of the good things that has come out of the pandemic. It opened up this possibility for us that we hadn't thought. And now it's not everybody's cup of tea. That's fine. There's a church I live in Pasadena, California. Lake Avenue Church is this really wonderful, larger church. And they have a lot of adult Sunday school classes, including one that's called the King's Couriers, where the average age has got to be 85 at least. I mean, this class has been meeting for 60 years. Okay. So I teach them sometimes. Well, one of their problems was their people, obviously some of their people have died, but others have moved away or they can't really make it into church anymore. And they'd never really thought about how to solve that until all of a sudden the pandemic comes and they've started doing they Zoom their class. Initially, it was all Zoom. That's all they could. So now we're back. I can teach them in person, but they do it all Zoom. It's like, it's hybrid. So they've got a little webcam in there, and they get about 10 or 12 people a week who otherwise couldn't connect. So I just think part of as we emerge is we need to think, gosh, what have we learned that could actually enrich our lives and our relationships now? And that's one of them. Now, I'm not saying, Zoom is the kingdom of heaven. Part of me hates Zoom, but we wouldn't be doing this. We just wouldn't be doing this. So there's much to be learned, and there's some real benefit.
Indeed, there is. So let's talk a little bit about what you've done to put some feet to this notion of flourishing. I know that you've developed recently a video course that expands on the whole theme of flourishing. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, about 4 years ago, I really started digging into this stuff, the last 3 especially, and reading a lot. Your book actually was one of the early books that I read, and then we did that webinar together. I've done a lot of academic reading. I probably read, by now, I don't know, 400 academic articles from gerontology or psychology and neuroscience. I can't completely understand all of that stuff, but I can kind of follow it. And my question all along has been, once we just said, okay, we're going to talk about flourishing. So what's important for flourishing in this season of life? And over time, I got down to sort of really 6 major things. Not that that's everything, but it's quite a bit of something. One of those things is purpose. And you folks are the ones who really first raised that flag for me. We did that Power Purpose in a Pandemic. That was what we called our webinar. And so anyway, as I learned all this, I began to pull it together, started teaching on it, writing on it, interacting with people on it. And ultimately, actually, at the webinar we did, there was a pastor from a church in Texas who was there. He contacted me afterwards. We started talking, and we entered into a partnership to produce for his church a course that's called Flourishing in the Third of Life. But it's not just for his church. They sort of helped it to happen, supported it financially, gave an opportunity to prototype it. But now it's a Dupree Center course. So we now have this course called Flourishing in the Third of Life. It's 6 sessions. Each session starts with about a half-hour lecture that I give on some facet of flourishing. And then there are suggested small group questions. For those who want to go deeper, there's a workbook that has personal study and devotional guides and other sorts of things. So the workbook itself is quite substantial. It's 150 pages-ish. But the course is meant so that a group of people can easily go through it in an hour, hour and 15 minutes, depending on how long you want for discussion over a 6-week period. And that's been out for just about 6 weeks. We're beginning to hear some really good things. So that's a resource we have if people are saying for themselves or for their church, what can we do with this? Is there a way we can access some of the things you've been learning? And the answer now is yes, there is this course. You're muted. You're still muted.
Is it suitable?
There you are.
Is it suitable for individuals? Yes.
Yes. In fact, so far, because it's only been out for a little while, and if you're from a church, you probably have to get permission, and there's a process before you can purchase something. We sell it. I should say that. And let me just say, we sell it. So it sort of has two pieces. One piece is called the Leader Kit. The Leader Kit is basically a workbook and lifetime access to the videos. So part of the thing is, if you buy the Leader Kit, you don't own a physical thing. It's all streamed, but you can use it forever. So you get, and that's $125. Then individuals who take the course pay, or their organization pays $10.99 for them to get a PDF version of the workbook. Now, an organization can print them if they want, or individuals can, or they can use it digitally. That's their choice. So one of how we make this available is digital, basically. So Leaders Kit, $125, workbook $10. If you're an individual or a couple, you and your wife want to do it, you can get the Leaders Kit, which is everything you need, at half off. So there's a 50% discount. So it's whatever that is, $60 and something. And you own that for yourself. If you decide later you want to do it for your church, then we figure it out. And I should also say, we're selling this thing. Many churches, many individuals can afford it, but we're also really committed to working with people. So there was a church in South Africa contacted us, said, we really don't have the resources to buy this thing. So we figured out how we're going to work with them on that. But in the market, what we're selling for is pretty reasonable. So your question, is it good for individuals? It works great for individuals. The lectures, of course, work that way. The small group questions could easily be personal reflection questions. So that's why I say, and the people who have bought it and have used it as individuals so far, what I'm hearing from people is it works well in that context, even though it was built mainly for church groups and other kind of groups.
Well, we had a similar experience back in 2018 when we had an opportunity to put our entire retreat curriculum on a video-based course we call Reignite You. And we went through quite a learning curve to get that filmed and edited and posted. And one of the things that we've learned from that is that people with an online video course individually tend to get bogged down in the middle. And not complete it. And that's been one of the disappointments, I would say, in seeing people work all the way through it. So the idea of doing it as a group with a cohort or in a class would keep them on track toward completion of that. I could see that as a real strength. And so we've encouraged that even in our course. But
that's true. And you probably know from the research, there's been all this online education in the last 10 years, 15 years. And what you experience is exactly what's true of all the major online courses that, you sign up for some MOOC from Columbia University. And if you're on your own, you may not get through it. If you're in some sort of cohort experience, group experience, chances are much better that you will.
I spoke with a coordinator for a national ministry where people paid $200 for this course, and he would have to doggedly pursue them to complete it, to get their certification for administering the assessment. So I applaud the notion of using that in a group setting. I think we're about to open it up for some Q&A, unless you want to add anything to that conversation about flourishing and the course. Any other thoughts before we do that?
Well, I may be anticipating where you're going, but I would love to hear a little bit more about your book. Do you want to wait to the end to do that? And we'll just go into Q&A now.
Oh, well,
Well,
let me just be the first one to have a question.
go ahead,
Okay.
Leona.
All right.
No, I want to go back a little bit to what you said about some of the ageism that
Mhm.
we find in our society just across the board anyway. But we found when we added this horrible pandemic, from the get-go, there was a line drawn. And
Yeah.
I remember all of a sudden, whoa, they drew the line at 65. Those people are all elderly and they're all going to get sick, and or else you're going to make them sick. And there was even this ageism that came out of the pandemic,
Hmm.
even to the point, I think, where there was some blame that we all have to shut down and we all have to wear masks to keep all those old
Yeah.
people from getting
Right.
sick. So part of what I see even in Flourishing is coming out of not just the general society ageism that we experience to a degree, but
Yeah.
how do we navigate coming back into the fold as
Right.
old people, as it were. That
Well,
was difficult for us, for me,
yeah,
to see all of a sudden they drew the line at younger than
I
me.
know. I know. I got it, although I actually liked it that I could get the vaccine early because
Well,
I'm
this is true. There were
65.
benefits, absolutely.
But you're right. And, you know, um, Google, you can set up Google to sort of look through all news sources and flag certain words. So I have Google do this on ageism. So every day I get these articles. So one of the things that's clear, and you said it, Leona, but that ageism, that is bias against people who are older. Actually, ageism can go the other way too. It could be bias against younger people, but that's not what we're talking about here. I mean, it is a pandemic. It is everywhere, and it is pernicious. And partly that's where Rebecca Levy's stuff is so important, because it says if you believe the negative things about aging yourself, you're actually going to live shorter and not so well. I mean, it's really important. So, and of course, the pandemic accentuated certain things that older people can have more frailty. Now, you live up in the Pacific Northwest, so you were kind of, the hot spot of this, and it's nursing homes and it's old people. And uh, so we have some work to do, right, to educate more broadly, but also to educate ourselves. Now, here's what has been for you asked earlier about surprises. Here's for me something that at first is surprising, ultimately it makes sense. If you start looking into studies now on what happened during the pandemic, there are many coming out that say actually older adults fared better emotionally than younger adults. A study from the United States, there's one from Singapore, there's one from Hong Kong. These things are emerging that older adults actually had more emotional resilience in this than younger adults, which I say on the one hand, I'm sort of surprised, because the general thought is, well, the pandemic showed how old people are, we're just, you know, we're over the hill and we're done. This says actually, and part of what it points to is that though those of us who are older may have certain physical issues or limitations, right? I used to jog. I can't jog anymore. My knees won't let me jog. I can't do it. That's true and that's real. But older adults also have certain things that in general younger people don't have. And the word they're using a lot is resilience. Mm-hmm. That older people have resilience. Now, as we emerge from the pandemic, it's not only that we want to live better for ourselves, but we actually have things that are desperately needed in our world. Those of us who are older, we sometimes talk about it in terms of wisdom too, but it's been defined and identified that we have things to offer that the world needs, even as we need what the world can give to us. And I would just say, I think the world, this is also true in the church. I mean, there is the tendency for there to be significant ageism in the church. And there's another area. I know a man who was He ran a very large company in the Midwest. He retired, went to his pastor basically to say, how can I help? Right? I mean, here's this extremely talented and successful person. He's now got a bunch of time in his hands. His pastor said, well, we've got this team of people that meets on Thursdays to fold the bulletins. I'm not kidding you. Well, that reflects a kind of an ageist view that now that you're retired, you really are not able to do amazing things, but you can fold the bulletins. So we've also got work in the church to help leaders and church people and all understand. Anyway, do we want to do some more questions?
Just let me echo, and then everybody else can answer. But the term resilience, I've done a lot of study about that. Maybe what we've experienced as our generation through the pandemic, if we come out resilient and, to use your word, flourishing, maybe that's the greatest gift we give to the generations below us. And so how can we even use some of your material intergenerationally? Is there a possibility for us opening discussions throughout the generations? And now I will now go on mute so everybody else can ask their questions. But great stuff, Mark. Thank you. We can't thank you enough, Dr. Roberts, for joining us. You're a friend and a peer and cohort in this ministry and a great encourager to all of us. We hope you'll all take advantage of the work that they've done. It's extensive in sharing how to flourish in the third. We hope you'll also take a peek at our book when it comes out, just because it helps us come together as a generation to experience again some of the things we went through and what we've learned and how God's going to open new doors. I am going to tell you something that we haven't expressed to anybody else, and we have not told Trudy this, but our opening dedication page is to Ted, and we have dedicated this book to our brother-in-law who influenced our lives greatly, and how Trudy continues to live out his legacy in her family. Anyway, emerging is about all of us, and we are grateful for God's faithfulness as we do that. So let me just close us with a thank you to the Lord for bringing us together. And we will keep you posted on all these new endeavors. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure having you, and we'll follow up with an email to everyone on some of these resources and ways to continue to flourish in the third of life. So thanks everyone for participating. This ends our meeting.
Great. Bye, everybody.